This is Franklin Rye, and welcome back to Political Spirits. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. So what are we going to talk about this week? Well, let's talk about something said by commentator Kirsten Powers on CNN, which was truly disappointing. Powers said that white women who supported President Trump are racist. She didn't limit the breadth of her claim that white female Trump supporters were racist by restricting that characterization to those who actually expressed racist sentiments, but rather she simply stated that Donald Trump has said multiple racist things. Then she stated that we don't have time to go into them, and then said, if you support someone who does racist things, you are a racist. In that respect, her comment actually isn't even limited to white women, but rather must also extend to white men, black women, Hispanic women, Asian women, and any voter from any other race who supports President Trump. Her comment literally paints nearly half the country with the brush of racism. Now, we've talked before in episode 5 of the podcast about the fact that Donald Trump's statements, which are characterized as racist, are not in fact racist. For example, we disproved the claim that Donald Trump said that all Mexicans are rapists. He didn't say that, and even PolitiFact acknowledged that he didn't say that. Kirsten Powers is apparently pointing to his statements about that issue because she talks about his racist comments going back to when he announced his campaign. No doubt she's also thinking of the instance when he described severely economically depressed countries with language worthy of censorship, and which you've heard me censor with that ubiquitous popping cork sound. But likewise, I previously addressed and disproved the claim that language was racist. Indelicate? Certainly. Language you typically hear from a president? Certainly not. Racist? Absolutely not. This is perhaps the most recent and one of the most extreme examples of what I talked about previously, which is that conservatives view liberals as wrong, and liberals view conservatives as bad people. But even accepting that liberals and conservatives characterize their political opposites that way, it is truly disappointing that Kirsten Powers has effectively labeled nearly half of the electorate as racist. Someone should ask Ms. Powers, how do you go on living in a country where you believe that over 60 million of your fellow citizens, nearly half the electorate, are racists? Why didn't she instead conclude that over 60 million of her fellow citizens simply disagreed with her evaluation of Donald Trump, simply disagreed with her evaluation of what public policy prescriptions the country needed, simply disagreed with her evaluation of what should be done regarding illegal immigration? Instead, she chose to wrap herself in a mantle of superiority, believing that her political beliefs are driven by pure motivations, whereas those who disagree with her are driven by racism, a cancer which has stained our history and apparently, according to Kirsten Powers, continues to infect over 60 million Americans, a diagnosis which she reached simply based on their support for the current President of the United States. Kirsten Powers has always commented from the left, but when she was on Fox News, she was closer to the center. The sentiment that she expressed on CNN is extreme left, and unfortunately becoming more and more common on CNN. Think about what can happen in a country where half of the electorate believes the other half is racist. Now think about how problematic that is when the country is one which once allowed slavery, and which once systematically oppressed blacks based on the color of their skin after slavery ended. For years I've said that when I go to the voting booth, I vote for the candidate who I believe will be the best for the country. Perhaps I'm fooling myself, but I think not. My motivation is my kids, and their children yet to be born, and their children's children yet to be born. I want the country to thrive, not just for me, but for them, not just for them, but for all Americans. Did Kirsten Powers think about the future we face if her fellow Trump opponents all feel as she does? Can a country thrive or even survive, where half the electorate believes the other half is motivated by the most vile of prejudices? Is she living in the same country as me? Every day, whether at work, in a restaurant, in a store, in a gas station, at a bar, at a concert, at the movies, or whenever I encounter fellow Americans of every race, it makes no difference. Of course it doesn't matter whether the person getting popcorn for me at the movie counter or sitting next to me in the movie theater is of a different race than me. And I voted for Donald Trump enthusiastically in the general election. As I told my friends, I would have dragged myself across broken glass to get to the voting booth. I still support President Trump enthusiastically. Do I agree with everything he's done and said? Of course not. The only way that could happen is if I was elected president myself. Using Kirsten Powers' reasoning, I must be racist. Yet I know that I am not. For decades, America has been known as the safe place to invest. Our legal system is a model of stability. Our government, split into 3 branches at the federal level, is less prone to destabilizing wild swings in the economy. But when you hear commentators like Kirsten Powers expressing disturbing and frankly depressing opinions about effectively half the country, you have to wonder whether at some point America will lose its position as the safe place to invest because investors will question its stability. After all, how stable can a country be when half its population considers the other half to be driven by the most vile of motivations? I have an alternative proposition. The left that sees the right as driven by racism is itself not driven by altruistic motives. Instead, the left that holds that view is driven by self-righteousness. Perhaps so many years of being told by the media and academia that it is right has gone to the head of those on the left. I find it ironic that a significant portion of the left exhibits the attitudes and behaviors attributed to the stereotypes of the very religious in America, especially the very religious in America at a time when that portion of the country was largely in a position of power. When portrayed in books or movies or addressed by commentators, self-righteousness is the characteristic typically attributed to the very religious. They are portrayed as looking down their noses at the rest of society because the rest of society doesn't live up to their moral standards. The irony, of course, is that it is the left which is now so likely to look down its noses at the rest of society because the rest of society it views as not living up to its moral standards with regard to a whole host of political issues, such as immigration, gun control, and, incredibly, abortion rights. In that respect, leftism has become the new religion. Unfortunately, the fact that it isn't actually a religion lends itself to its proponents failing to recognize that they're exhibiting the self-righteousness which they abhor when exhibited in connection with religion, as practiced in the stereotypical manner in which they depict it. Moreover, while they of course recognize the danger which can arise when religion and politics become intertwined, they fail to recognize the danger when politics is practiced as a virtual religion. We'll take this discussion further in a future episode that delves into the ways in which leftism has become a religion rather than simply focusing on the self-righteousness in the way many on the left behave. But this discussion of self-righteousness among the left leads into my next topic. The most recent example of the arrogance of Barack Obama. We all know that President Trump is boastful to the point of arrogance. It's one of the defining characteristics of his personality. To say that it's over the top is an understatement. He takes it to the point that it sometimes seems like he's a late-night TV direct marketing pitchman, and the product he's selling is himself. The fact that he seems that way has garnered him endless negative commentary from commentators not just on the left, but also from those Republicans who've been called never-Trumpers. President Obama, on the other hand, has typically been characterized by the political commentariat as sophisticated, urbane, the utmost example of someone who behaves in a presidential manner. As I've said before, coverage of President Obama was best described as worshipful. The failure to adequately cover his recent example of statements which exhibit arrogance and disdain for politicians other than himself continues that trend. The statements by former President Barack Obama were made to author Doug Eggers at the Obama Foundation Summit in Chicago. The comments themselves began circulating after James Woods tweeted about them, noting that Obama, quote, dismissed the value of every political figure he's dealt with in the entire world in 1 minute and 19 seconds, close quote. That aspect of the speech was further reported on in the Daily Wire in an article by James Barrett on November 22nd. Here's what former President Obama had to say. Quote, here's the interesting thing that happens when you're president, or when you go through the experience of being president. So you start off, you know you're a community organizer and you're struggling to get people to recognize each other's common interests. You're trying to get some project done in a small community. You start thinking, okay, you know what, this alderman is a knucklehead, and they're resistant to doing the right thing, and so I need to get more knowledge, more power, more influence, so I can really have an impact. And so you go to the state legislature, and you look around and you say, well, these jamokes, I mean, not all of them, but I'm just saying, you start getting the sense of, this is just like dealing with that alderman. So I got to do something different. Then you go to the U.S. Senate, and you're looking around, and you're like, oh, man. And then when you're president, you're sitting in these international meetings, and it's like the G20, and you got all these world leaders, and it's the same people. Close quote. Think about what Barack Obama just said. He just called leaders at every level of government which he's dealt with over the course of his career jamokes. He just said they all have the same level of intelligence as a cup of coffee. But he stands out apart from them. The one with the intelligence, the one that could get things done, if only those jamokes would get with the program. Think about how arrogant that is. Is it worse than President Trump's arrogance? Well, notice that President Trump calls people names when it can help him defeat them. Think, for example, of the endless string of labels he gave to his opponents in the Republican primaries, or to his opponents on issues since becoming president. But also look to the glowing praise that he would give to those who worked with him. Could I see President Trump saying something after his presidency which is like what former President Obama just said? Yes, actually I could. It wouldn't have the same tone. It would be more outwardly boastful, but perhaps actually somewhat less arrogant because it would be more like an over-the-top salesman or perhaps a bit cartoonish. But the bottom line is I could see him saying essentially the same thing. The difference would be in the coverage. If a former President Trump said it, the adverse coverage would be virtually endless. Moreover, virtually the entire media would refuse to acknowledge the extreme disparity in coverage. Is that because they're jamokes? No, they know exactly what they're doing. Next topic. The controversial statement made on Twitter by President Trump about the California wildfires. President Trump has received a lot of adverse publicity regarding a tweet that he made recently about California wildfires. Specifically, on November 10, he tweeted, quote, "There's no reason for these massive, deadly, and costly forest fires in California except that forest management is so poor. Billions of dollars are given each year, with so many lives lost, all because of the gross mismanagement of the forests. Remedy now, or no more Fed payments." Close quote. He ended that tweet with an exclamation point. Now, I've generally been supportive of the president's tweeting. To those who say it's not presidential, I simply respond that the media is almost uniformly opposed to him, not just to the point of having a negative slant, but rather to the point it seems that they're actually trying to destroy his presidency, that they're actual members of the resistance. In that situation, is it reasonable to expect the president to turn his back on the powerful means of communications he has through Twitter, when the alternative is to expect that his message will be delivered through the press after he issues more traditional press releases or other statements? No, it isn't. In his situation, it's easy to understand why he uses Twitter. However, I have always recognized that there are serious limitations to Twitter, and one of them is that because of the character limitations, nuance is not really readily achievable. Moreover, regardless of the media vehicle, President Trump shouldn't have threatened to cut off federal payments in a statement issued while the fires were still being fought and people were dying. A more lengthy formal statement would have allowed for the nuance necessary to make the point that there needs to be discussion about effective use of federal funds for forestry management in California. But an outright threat to revoke funding with fires still raging? That was not a good idea. I should note at this point that notwithstanding the threat to revoke funding, President Trump did issue the disaster declarations to facilitate federal relief that the state had requested. So let's talk about the truth or falsity of the claims made in the tweet. As is typically the case, the statement is absolute. Quote, "There is no reason," close quote. That statement leaves no opening for fires the huge size of which are only partially the result of forestry mismanagement. It leaves no opening for fires which start in and spread through brushland rather than forests. Once again, using Twitter as the point of distribution makes nuance hard to come by. Moreover, this president admittedly doesn't excel at nuance. Did the president's tweets get anything right? Actually, yes. The contention at the core of the tweet that forests are not being adequately thinned and wood debris cleared from the forest floor is true. Even in the San Francisco Chronicle, certainly not a paper that anyone would consider a right-wing publication, an article on November 10 by Peter Fimwright and Curtis Alexander quoted a retired forestry and wildfire expert, Tom Bonnickson, stating, quote, "One problem that Trump kind of got right," Bonnickson said, "is that a century of fire suppression has left California's forest too thick. Recent fires burn faster and hotter," he said, "because of the high density of trees and abundant wood debris on the forest floor." Close quote. In another article in the Chronicle from the same day by Trapper Byrne and Curtis Alexander, Bonnickson is quoted as noting that the forests around Paradise, California, site of the Camp Fire, the largest, most destructive, and deadly of the fires, contain about 2,000 trees per acre as of a decade ago, and he noted that a healthy forest should have between 60 and 80 trees per acre. That's an astonishing difference. If you want to read a much more comprehensive analysis of why the large number of trees per acre contributes to fast-burning massive forest fires, you should read the article by Jim Carlton, dated November 17, in the Wall Street Journal. It's titled, quote, "Facing Deadlier Fires, California Tries Something New, More Logging," close quote. The article is subtitled, quote, "Environmentalists and the Timber Industry, after long butting heads, increasingly agree that cutting trees to thin forests is vital to reducing fire danger," close quote. The piece explains through illustrations how forests with large numbers of large and small trees in close proximity results in the small trees acting as ladders to elevate fires to the level of the canopy of the large trees so that small fires don't burn out on the forest floor and instead turn into massive conflagrations. Jim Branham, executive officer of the Sierra Nevada Conservancy, which is a California state agency which helped put together the partnership between environmentalists and the logging industry, notes that, quote, "Having the fuel loads in forests and wildlands reduced is definitely helpful in modifying fire behavior, but it needs to occur at a much greater scale than we're currently doing," close quote. What does that tell you? It tells you that the overall point that President Trump was making was true. The forests have been mismanaged. However, President Trump didn't acknowledge that steps are being taken to correct it. Will his tweet apply the pressure needed to accelerate the efforts between the logging industry and the environmentalists? Perhaps. Maybe that was his goal. Per the NBC News website, in a November 20 article by Phil Helsel, Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke laid part of the blame for wildfire conditions on, quote, radical environmental groups, close quote. He said, every time there's a thinning project out, who's suing? He went further, quote, when lawsuit after lawsuit by, yes, the radical environmental groups that would rather burn down the entire forest than cut a single tree or thin the forest, and it's easy to find out who is suing and who promulgates the destructive policies, close quote. It's clear that the view that forests have been mismanaged because of opposition to logging and forest thinning by environmental groups is not limited to the president himself. So what's the overall message I take from this? The first is that, as we all know, Twitter is both an advantage and disadvantage for President Trump. I really do wish he had held off from making the funding threat on Twitter. A warning on Twitter about the dangers of kowtowing to environmental groups which oppose thinning of the forests, perhaps with another tweet noting that there are cooperative efforts underway, would have produced the desired effect that he wanted without the blowback. Moreover, despite the multitude of articles I've read about the California wildfires, the article that actually conveyed the most technical information about the forest thinning issue, the one which very effectively described how the presence of small trees with large trees results in the catastrophic fires, was in the Wall Street Journal. So the other message we should take from this particular issue is the reminder that I've given a multitude of times on this podcast. We should get our news and political opinions from multiple sources with differing viewpoints so that we don't live in a bubble. Hopefully, you'll continue to make Political Spirits one of your sources for news and political opinion. Please join me for the next episode next week. Until then, be sure to tell your friends about Political Spirits. And follow me on Twitter at Franklin Rye. Like me on Facebook at Political Spirits. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.